Hello Internet people, I'm here to present another build for you. This one is a Molten Shell build, or at least that's what it was supposed to be. I'm going to go ahead and load up a shaped desert map really quick, and I'm going to go ahead and explain this while I go in. So the first thing that you're going to notice when I start actually fighting people with this build is that it has a very low clear speed. I'm not sure if that's only because of the mistakes that I made, or if just because this build is kind of crap in the first place. But, you know, if you care about clear speed, I would definitely not recommend this build. In some ways, the build turned more into a Flame Blast build than an actual Molten Shell build. I do still use Molten Shell, and Molten Shell still hits really hard, but in a lot of cases my Flame Blast is actually ending up doing more damage. And I mean, that just kind of is what it is. All of the damage notes that I got from Molten Shell also apply to Flame Blast, since Flame Blast is an AoE fire spell. So, yeah. If that bothers you, I once again wouldn't actually recommend doing this build. It's a relatively survivable build, primarily because I'm stacking a ridiculous amount of armor. I can't really remember how much armor I have, so let me pull up my character screen here. I have around 42k armor, which means that if I were to take a hit for 4k damage, I would mitigate half of that hit. Now, obviously, if I take a hit for 10k damage, it's not really going to stop me from getting one shot. Right now, if you notice, I have a little bit less than 4k health, and I have practically zero energy shield, and that's a problem. However, I think that is a problem solvable with gear. This is very much a budget build for me so far, just because it was a proof of concept. Anyway, so as you see, I'm just running around flame blasting. The way that this build works is essentially I have one of the uniques that you're basically only going to be able to get from Legacy League for cheap. It's called Scold's Bridle. It causes you to deal damage to yourself based on the mana cost of things that you're casting. Now, I know the wiki was incorrect about this at the time. I'm not sure if it's been updated yet, but when you're channeling, it does actually damage you for every tick of mana that you use while channeling. That means that I'm basically constantly damaging myself for a fairly small amount of damage, and because of that, I actually pop my own Molten Shell. If I just stand here and cast my Molten Shell, I'll eventually pop the Molten Shell just by casting Flame Blast. My Molten Shell is set to cast on channel on my Flame Blast, and so that means that my Molten Shell will constantly recast itself. And one of the interesting things about the way that the Molten Shell mechanic works is that when it recasts itself, it does not reset its absorption. Instead, it just continues with the same amount of absorption that it had before, meaning that the constant recast isn't actually preventing it from exploding like you'd probably expect. Anyway. So aside from that, the way that I make it pop on myself is I also use the Jewel Fevered Mind, which causes my skills to cost 100% increased mana. If you wanted it to pop faster, you could stack multiple Fevered Minds. I actually tried this early on. I realized pretty fast that it kind of drains my mana a little bit too quickly. Even now with the single Fevered Mind, I kind of have to constantly pop mana flasks. But it is what it is. I do use 2 Praxis Rings. I don't think the 2 Praxis Rings are really necessary. I was just trying things out, and Praxis Rings seemed like a good plan at the time. That refunds some of my damage when it refunds some of my mana when I damage myself by spending mana because of Scold's Bridle. So overall, my Molten Shell itself, it says 15,000 tooltip damage here. I think it's significantly higher than that when I'm actually in a map. I probably should have looked at it while I was in there. Aside from that, I've obviously got my Flame Blast, which is right here, which is only 1900 damage base, though, you know, I have many buffs when I'm inside, and there's also the stacking damage of Flame Blast, so it ends up doing a lot more than that, as you've seen. The Molten Shell definitely still hits harder than the Flame Blast, and I know that 15,000 damage isn't a particularly large amount of damage. I used Oriana's Catalyst, but that's just because it happens to be basically the highest damage scepter that I could get for cheap. And honestly, aside from those Praxises and the Scold's Bridle, and the Praxises are really optional, there are no other uniques that this build relies on. My tree naturally goes for a lot of fire damage, it goes for a lot of life, and obviously it goes for a lot of armor. And yeah, that's really about it. There's not really anything secret about how this build works. It just kind of happens. Again, ridiculously low cleared speed. I don't think I'd really recommend the build, but, you know, if you want to have fun with a build where you're pretty tanky and you just kind of get hit in the face and do a lot of damage whenever you're getting hit in the face, it's a kind of fun build to play. I mean, I got it all the way up to level 77 without getting too bored of it, so. Anyway, I have one more video coming next inside of this league, and then I'm going to be on break until Oriath comes out. The next video is going to be a Detonate Dead focused build, and that one is probably going to be a lot more interesting than this one. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any suggestions, and have a fantastic evening.